Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled 30 Years of Failed Climate Predictions. 30 years ago today, NASA's James Hansen testified before Congress. Here's how Fox News described it. NASA's chilling 30-year-old warning. We were warned. On June 23, 1988, a sultry day in Washington, James Hansen told the U.S. Congress and the world that global warming wasn't approaching, it had already arrived. The testimony of the top NASA scientist was the opening salvo of the age of climate change. 30 years later, it's clear that Hansen and other doomsayers were right, but the change has been so sweeping that it's easy to lose sight of effects large and small, some obvious, others less conspicuous. Earth is noticeably hotter, the weather stormier and more extreme. Polar regions have lost billions of tons of ice. Sea levels have been raised by trillions of gallons of water. Far more wildfires rage. Wow, this all sounds really bad. If Fox News says it, it must be true. Well, let's go back in time 30 years and see what's actually happened. 30 years ago today, James Hansen testified before the Senate. He said, global warming has begun. Sharp cut and burning of fossil fuels is urged to battle shift in climate. But the war against fossil fuels didn't actually begin that day. It began more than a decade earlier when President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, warned the United States we needed to cut back on our energy usage. August 11th, 1975. Berkeley, California. The United States is threatened far more by the hazards of too much energy too soon than by the hazards of too little too late. The hazards of too much, which have been widely underestimated as the liabilities of too little, have been exaggerated, include diverting financial resources from compelling social needs, making hasty commitments to unproved technologies, and generating environmental and social costs that harm human welfare far more than the extra energy improves it. Nothing Holdren said made any sense or had any basis in reality, but that was fairly typical of his genre. Now let's jump to June 22, 1988, the day before Hansen's testimony to Congress. Hansen's testimony was organized by Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado. We called the Weather Bureau and found out what historically was the hottest day of summer. So we scheduled the hearing that day, and bingo, it was the hottest day on record in Washington or close to it. It was stiflingly hot that summer. What we did was went in the night before and opened all the windows. I'll admit it, right? So that the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room. So Hansen's giving this testimony. You've got those television cameras back there heating up the room, and the air conditioning in the room didn't appear to work. So it was a perfect collection of events that happened that day, with the wonderful Jim Hansen who was wiping his brow at the witness table and giving this remarkable testimony. Senator Wirth was right. June 22, 1988 was by far the hottest June 22nd on record in the United States. 71% of the U.S. was over 90 degrees that day. Generally, June 22nd temperatures have declined in the U.S. over the last century, but 1988 was a major exception. It was really hot that day, and Senator Wirth and James Hansen went in and sabotaged the air conditioner at Congress the night before. This map shows temperatures on June 22, 1988. The yellow dots represent over 90 degrees, and you can see that almost the entire country was over 90 degrees. And the red dots represent 100 degrees. You can see there's 100-degree temperatures coast to coast, including in the Washington, D.C. area. This graph shows June 22nd temperatures at Lincoln, Virginia, just west of Washington, D.C. You can see that they've generally declined about 3 degrees over the last 90 years. But 1988, it was very hot that day. This year was one of the coolest on record in the D.C. area, though. 66 degrees was the forecast high yesterday at Winchester, Virginia. So temperatures in the Washington, D.C. area are almost 30 degrees cooler this year than they were 30 years ago in 1988. But it wasn't just hot during the summer of 1988. There was also a terrible drought covering the country. The Mississippi River nearly dried up that summer. West Tennessee is shriveling in a drought, and nobody's sure what's causing it or when it will end. While scientists and weather experts toss around theories about sunspot cycles and Pacific sea surface temperatures, rain clouds continue to elude the area and everything keeps getting drier and drier. This article was dated June 19, 1988, and 4 days later James Hansen came to Congress and he definitively told everyone what was causing the heat and drought. It was emissions from their automobiles. They needed to quit driving. Everything was so simple now. This farmer's tractor was causing the heat and drought, which was ruining his farm. There were many dry years in the 1980s, but the drought of 1988 was the worst, and low water levels forced hydroelectric plants to shut down. The heat and drought led to massive fires that summer. In fact, Yellowstone National Park nearly burned up. So the stage was set for Hansen. It was extremely hot, it was extremely dry, and there were fires burning. Well, Fox News says that Hansen got everything right. So now let's look at Hansen's specific predictions and see if Fox News is correct about that. Here's what Hansen said in that testimony. Our climate model simulations for the late 1980s and the 1990s indicate a tendency for an increase of heat wave drought conditions in the southeast and Midwest United States. So here's the NOAA graph for Midwest precipitation since 1988. It was very dry back then, but since then almost every single year has been above normal precipitation, and it's getting wetter in the Midwest. So Hansen got that prediction exactly backwards. Hansen was dead wrong with his forecasts about drought. Now let's look at his forecast for temperature. Here's what he said. The number of days per year in which the maximum daily temperature exceeds 100 degrees increased from about 1 in 1988 to 12 in Washington and from 3 to 20 in Omaha. The number of days with maximum temperature exceeding 90 degrees increases from about 35 days in 1988 to 85 days in the future in both cities. So Hansen is forecasting a huge increase in the number of 90 degree and 100 degree temperature days. Well, this is easy enough to check out. Let's take a look at how he did. Ashland, Nebraska is the closest United States historical climatology network station to Omaha, and the number of 90-degree days there has plummeted since the 19th century. In fact, it's nearly dropped in half. Wow, Hansen got that prediction wrong. Similarly, the number of 100-degree days at Omaha has also plummeted. It's gone way down since the 1930s, and in the last few years they haven't had any 100-degree temperature days at all. Hansen completely messed up that forecast. Same story at Washington, D.C. The number of 90-degree days was very high in 1988. They had 53 of them, but they've gone way down since then. So Hansen missed about 90-degree days in the Washington, D.C. area. And the same thing with 100-degree days. They peaked in 1988 when Hansen gave his testimony, but they've gone way down since then. Hansen was completely wrong about Washington, D.C. too. Now let's look at some of Hansen's other forecasts. On the 20th anniversary of his testimony before Congress, which was 10 years ago, Hansen said, "We're toast." Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Well, it's 10 years now. Representative Ed Markey, Democrat Massachusetts committee chairman, said, "Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later we recognize him as a climate prophet." Well, let's see how the Democrats' climate prophet did. It's been 10 years. The Arctic should be free of ice now. These maps from the Danish Meteorological Institute show sea ice thickness on June 22nd this year and June 22nd, 2008, when Hansen made that forecast that we'd be ice-free now. Well, you can see what happened. There's lots of thick sea ice now all around the Arctic. This red represents ice more than 4 meters thick. But 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of thick ice. In fact, the ice was so thin near the North Pole that summer that many top climate experts predicted the North Pole was going to be ice-free that summer. Well, Hansen was wrong, and they were wrong too. Instead of getting thinner and disappearing, the ice has gotten much thicker over the last decade. In fact, data from the Danish Meteorological Institute shows us that Arctic sea ice volume is the highest it's been since 2005. It's not disappearing. The ice is getting thicker. Hansen totally messed up that forecast. Let's look at some of his other ones. June 24th, 1988. Heat would cause inland waters to evaporate more rapidly, thus lowering the level of bodies of water such as the Great Lakes. The global warming signal had arrived, Hansen said. So Hansen said the Great Lakes were going to dry up. Let's see how that forecast did. Well, data from NOAA shows us that the Great Lakes water levels have increased substantially and are now close to record highs. Once again, Hansen completely got his forecast backwards, like with all of his other ones. Here's another James Hansen forecast from 1988. He predicted that within 30 years, i.e. this year, lower Manhattan would be underwater. Salon magazine. Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect for Congress. I went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City and said, if what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years? Hansen said, the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater. You'll have signs in restaurants saying water by request only. When did he say this will happen? Within 20 or 30 years. And remember, we had this conversation in 1988. Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. So in 1988, he predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater within 30 years. Well, that's now. Well, here's a webcam image from this week from lower Manhattan, the West Side Highway. Doesn't look like it's underwater to me. In fact, tide gauge data from NOAA at lower Manhattan shows that sea level there is about exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. Well, Hansen completely messed up that forecast. So I've been showing you how Hansen made all these very specific predictions and got them all wrong. He basically messed everything up. So what do climate scientists say about it now? On 30th anniversary of James Hansen's landmark global warming congressional testimony, scientists agree he got it right. Hansen got it right, said scientist Stefan Rahmstorf of the Potsdam Institute in Germany. Amazing, remarkably prescient. And here's what the New York Times says. James Hansen wishes he wasn't so right about global warming. James Hansen wishes he was wrong. He wasn't. NASA's top climate scientist in 1988, Hansen warned the world about all kinds of horrible things, and he was right. Hansen won't say, I told you so. I don't want to be right in that sense, Hansen told the Associated Press in an interview in his New York penthouse apartment. That's because being right means the world is warming at an unprecedented pace, and ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland are melting. If those ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland melt, we're all going to drown. But wait a minute. The government says that Greenland gained ice last year. In this year's data, the blue line shows that Greenland is still gaining ice in summer, and it's way above normal. So last year Greenland gained ice, and this year Greenland gaining ice again. But Hansen says it's melting down, and we're going to drown. And what about Antarctica? Well, NASA says that Antarctica is also gaining ice. So NOAA says that Greenland's gaining ice, and NASA says that Antarctica is gaining ice. That sure doesn't sound like a meltdown to me. Hansen got everything exactly backwards, and he's toasted by climate scientists in the press as being a prophet and being right about everything. Because in climate science, everything is like Alice down the rabbit hole. Talking to climate scientists and climate journalists is like talking to the Mad Hatter. Whatever they say is normally the exact opposite of reality. So what's this all about? Well, United Nations climate official Otmar Edenhofer explained. He said, one has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with the environment anymore. We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy, said Edenhofer. So Edenhofer spilled the beans. Facts and data don't matter in climate science. It's all about redistributing the world's wealth, and it's all about controlling energy policy. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.